This was a family murder case that happened in Anhui, China. But the most terrifying part was not just that 5 victims were killed inside their own home. It was not just that the killers vanished almost immediately after the crime. The most terrifying part was that from the very beginning, the entire crime scene looked like it had been carefully staged. A business card marked with a bloody handprint, a black leather jacket with someone else's name written inside, a bottle of peanut milk mixed with poison. Every clue seemed to point toward the killer. But in the end, every clue turned out to be a trap. And what made the case even stranger was this. Just when the police were getting close to the real suspect, they discovered that one of the suspects was already dead. If the investigation had stopped there, this massacre might have become a cold case forever. But the truly incredible part is what happened next. The police eventually used a few pieces of hair found on a hotel bed and a door the dead suspect had knocked on before his death to uncover the other killer hiding behind the entire case. The time was late at night on the 9th of April 2010. Police in Mengkeng County, Anhui Province, China, received a very unusual emergency call. On the other end of the line was a child. In this story, we will call him Victim C. Victim C sounded extremely panicked. He told the dispatcher that bad people had come into his home, and the situation was dangerous. The call was short, but it was enough for everyone to realize that something terrible was happening. After receiving the call, 2 police officers immediately rushed to the scene. The crime scene was a local shop. It was an independent 2-story building. From the moment the call came in to the moment officers arrived, it took only about 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes would later become one of the most haunting details of the entire case. When the officers arrived, they found the front door of the building tightly shut. The area around the building was strangely quiet. Under normal circumstances, if someone had just called the police, there should have been someone asking for help inside. At the very least, there should have been some kind of sound. But there were no screams, no footsteps, no response at all. A terrible feeling started to rise. The officers were worried that the killers might still be inside the building. So one officer stayed outside to keep watch. The other officer climbed in through a window at the back of the building to check the situation. The moment he entered the house, he smelled a strong odor of blood following the blood trail. He went upstairs. There were scattered bloodstains along the stairway. When the officer reached a room on the 2nd floor, he realized the door could not be opened. At that moment, everyone's nerves were on edge. The door would not open. No one inside was responding. Could the killer still be hiding in that room? After the officer forced the door open, the scene in front of him was something no one there would ever forget. The male owner of the shop will be called Victim A, his wife will be called Victim B, and the child who had just made the emergency call was Victim C. All 3 were lying in a pool of blood. Soon after, police found 2 more victims in another room across the hallway. Here we will call them Victim D and Victim E. They were the parents of Victim B. In other words, the child who had called for help just minutes earlier had not survived either. A family of 5 had all been killed. Judging from the condition of the scene, the killers had been extremely brutal. After the victims were already down, there were still signs of additional wounds. This immediately led police to consider one possibility. Did the killers have some deep hatred toward this family? But as the investigation continued, the case quickly became more complicated. There were no obvious fingerprints at the scene. The rooms had not been heavily ransacked. And even more strangely, a large amount of cash was still left behind. It seemed like the killers had not taken all the money they could have taken. If this was revenge, why did the scene show signs that looked like robbery? If this was robbery, why were the killers so vicious? Soon, the first major clue appeared. Police found a business card inside Victim B's bag. On that business card, there was an obvious bloody handprint. The name on the card pointed to a man. Here we will call him Mr. Z. Paulus immediately brought Mr. Z in for questioning. Mr. Z said that he and Victim A, he said they usually had a decent relationship, but on the 9th of April he had been drinking. He claimed he could not clearly remember where he had gone or what he had done that day. That answer made Mr. Z a key person of interest, but police work cannot be based only on suspicion. It has to be based on evidence. So the police returned to the crime scene and began a more detailed examination of the blood evidence. Because there were 5 victims at the scene, the blood was extremely mixed. Trying to find blood that might belong to the killers among all that blood was incredibly difficult. But the forensic team did not give up. After repeated testing and comparison, investigators finally found blood from 2 suspects in a mixed bloodstain on the side wall of the stairway. This was a critical result. Neither of those 2 blood samples belonged to Mr. Z. That meant Mr. Z could basically be ruled out. But now, there was a new question. If Mr. Z was not the killer, why was that business card with a bloody handprint inside victim B's bag? Police began to re-examine the detail. If someone was dying and wanted to leave a clue for the police, what would they do? Or would they leave the clue somewhere more obvious? Maybe on the floor, maybe on the wall, maybe somewhere right next to them where investigators could see it immediately. The logic did not make sense. Police concluded that the business card was probably not a dying message left by the victim. It was more likely a false clue planted by the killers. In other words, the killers wanted police attention to move toward Mr. Z. This showed that the crime was not completely impulsive. The killers had at least some awareness of how to mislead an investigation. At the same time, police noticed another detail. Although a large amount of cash had not been taken, some money was scattered on the floor. Considering the timing of victim C's emergency call, and the fact that police arrived in only 5 minutes, investigators developed a new theory. The killers may have originally planned a home invasion robbery, but because the child called the police, they did not have enough time to continue searching for valuables. They had to flee in a hurry. This explained why the scene looked like both revenge and robbery. The brutality may have been about eliminating witnesses, and the cash left behind may have been left simply because the killers ran out of time. Based on the blood evidence at the scene, police believe there were probably 2 killers. After committing the crime, the 2 killers took the weapon with them. Their clothes were likely stained with blood. Since the police arrived so quickly, they probably did not dare to take the main road. Instead, they may have escaped through the fields and ditches behind the crime scene. And during that escape, they may have thrown away bloody items and tools connected to the crime. Following this theory, police began searching the surrounding area within several kilometers of the crime scene. Eventually, about 2 kilometers away, officers found several suspicious items near a well. There were cut-up rubber gloves. There was a face mask, and there was a blood-stained black leather jacket. That leather jacket became the second trap in the case. Forensic testing confirmed that the blood on the jacket was connected to the victims from the crime scene. More importantly, officers found a name inside the lining of the jacket. Here we will call that name Mr. W. Police immediately began investigating Mr. W. Soon, Mr. W. came into focus. According to the investigation, Mr. W. often carried knives. He was also closely connected to another man here. We will call that other man Mr. D. Even more coincidentally, before this family murder at the shop, more than a dozen robbery cases had occurred in Mengcheng County and remained unsolved. Some victims' descriptions of the suspects were similar to the appearance of Mr. W. and Mr. D. Their method of committing crimes also seemed similar to the violent pattern shown in the shop massacre. For a moment, police believed these 2 men might be the suspects in the murder of the family of 5. But the interrogation brought another reversal. Mr. W. and Mr. D. admitted that they had committed multiple robberies, but they denied having anything to do with the murder of the family of 5 at the shop. Police then collected their DNA and compared it with the suspect blood found at the crime scene. The results showed that they were not the killers in the shop massacre. This time, the police had accidentally solved more than a dozen local robbery cases, but they still had not found the people who killed victim A's family. So what exactly was going on with the blood-stained leather jacket that had Mr. W's name inside? Was it really just a coincidence? As the investigation continued, police learned that some local dry cleaners had a habit. After customers brought clothes in for cleaning, the shop would sew a small cloth tag inside the lining. That tag was used to record the customer's name, the number of items, or unpaid cleaning fees. In other words, The name Mr. W inside the leather jacket did not necessarily mean Mr. W owned the jacket. It may have been only a mark left by a dry cleaner. Police then checked more than 70 dry cleaning shops across Mengchong County, but every shop owner said they had never seen that black leather jacket before. Once again, the lead went cold. The case seemed to have gone in a huge circle and returned to the starting point. But the police did not give up. They held another case analysis meeting and returned to the most basic question. Why were the killers able to escape so quickly after committing the crime late at night? And why were they able to find such a hidden place to dump the crime-related items? This suggested that the killers were probably very familiar with the area around the crime scene. Maybe they were not outsiders. Maybe they were locals. Or at least they had lived or worked nearby before. Following this direction, police began a large-scale DNA collection and comparison in the villages surrounding the crime scene. More than 1,000 villagers were included in the screening, but when the results came back, not one of them matched the suspect DNA from the scene. It looked as if the investigation had gone in the wrong direction again. Just as the case fell into another dead end, a careful officer remembered someone who had seemed unimportant. Here, we will call this person Mr. Phi. The reason Mr. F drew attention was because his son had once worked short-term at the shop. Here, we will call that son Suspect H. That meant Suspect H had some knowledge of Victim A's family, the layout of the shop, and the surrounding environment. In the early stage of the investigation, Mr. F had actually been one of the key people police focused on. But his DNA did not match the blood left at the scene. Under normal logic, fathers and sons share genetic links. So if Mr. F did not match, then his biological son Suspect H should not have matched either. That is why this lead had been set aside at first, but later, police noticed something strange. Mr. F seemed unusually interested in the investigation. He kept approaching officers and asking about the progress of the case. Why would an ordinary villager be so interested in this investigation? Police began to wonder about something else. What if Suspect H was not actually Mr. F's biological? To verify this possibility, police collected DNA from Suspect H's child for comparison. The result immediately changed the direction of the case. Suspect H and Mr. F were not biologically related as father and son. In other words, the earlier decision to rule out Suspect H based on Mr. F's DNA was not valid. Police then collected biological information connected to Suspect H and compared it again. In the end, they confirmed that Suspect H was one of the killers in the shop massacre. Through an online account once used by Suspect H, police contacted him while pretending to be an internet user. They learned that he had fled to Jilin province in China. That was roughly like fleeing across 3 states in the United States. Police immediately rushed to Nang'an, but when investigators arrived, Suspect H had already disappeared. After days of searching, police still could not find him. Then as everyone became more anxious, police made a bold assumption. Could Suspect H already be dead? If he was dead, then no arrest operation would ever find him. With that possibility in mind, officers went to the local funeral home to check. By coincidence, the funeral home had just received an unidentified male body. Through facial features and DNA comparison, police confirmed that the unidentified body was Suspect H, but the case was still not over. Because Suspect H's death was also full of suspicious details, police found that Suspect H had died from poisoning. Inside the hotel room where he had stayed before his death, police found a bottle of poisoned peanut milk. On the surface, it looked like Suspect H had killed himself out of guilt. If the case had been but investigators did not accept that conclusion too quickly. They found small pieces of hair on Suspect H's bed. Those pieces of hair suggested that Suspect H may have gotten a haircut before he died. If someone had already decided to commit suicide, why would he get a haircut first? Was he trying to leave this world looking presentable, or was he not planning to die at all, and instead preparing to meet someone? Police went to a nearby barbershop to ask questions. A barber remembered that on the night Suspect H died, a man who looked very much like Suspect H had come in for a haircut. He also said he was going to meet someone he had met online. That statement was extremely important. If Suspect H was preparing to meet someone online, then he may not have intended to die. The hotel owner also provided another detail. After suspect H returned from the haircut, he had knocked on the door of another room. He knocked several times, but no one answered. Police immediately checked the hotel registration records. The room suspect H had knocked on was registered to a man. Here we will call him Suspect Y. Even more coincidentally, Suspect Y and Suspect H had checked into the hotel on the same day, and on the day Suspect H died. Suspect Y checked out and left. This man was very likely the other killer in the case. Police continued examining the scene and found another important detail. From the window of Suspect Y's room, he could see the barbershop that Suspect H had visited before his death. In other words, Suspect Y may have been secretly watching Suspect H the entire time. 2 days later, police arrested Suspect Y in Harbin. China DNA comparison confirmed that Suspect Y was the other killer in the shop massacre. At this point, the real truth of the case finally began to surface. According to Suspect Y, he and Suspect H had once worked together as cooks in Zhejiang. Suspect Y was Suspect H's mentor. The two believed that earning money through ordinary work was too slow, so they developed the idea. Later, they went near Suspect H's hometown and began looking for a target. After repeatedly scouting the area, they chose this shop. On the night of the 9th of April 2010, the two entered the shop to commit robbery. To leave no witnesses behind, they attacked Victim A's family. Then they killed Victim D and Victim E as well. Victim C called the police while in danger, and that disrupted their plan. Because the police arrived so quickly, the two killers only managed to take 800 yuan in cash before fleeing the scene. Before leaving, they also planted the bloody handprint on Mr. Z's business card. They wanted to redirect the investigation towards someone else. After that, they threw away the gloves, mask, and blood-stained leather jacket while escaping. The name inside that leather jacket once again pushed the police in the wrong direction. But the most chilling part was this. From the very beginning, Suspect Y had prepared an even deeper plan. He knew that as long as Suspect H was alive, he would always be at risk of being exposed. So he deliberately placed many traces of the crime in a way that pointed towards Suspect H. His ultimate goal was to make Suspect H look like the only killer. And only after Suspect H was dead could Suspect Y truly feel safe. After the two fled to Jilin, Suspect Y pretended to be extremely afraid of being caught by the police. He suggested that each of them prepare poison. If things became hopeless, they would kill themselves together. Suspect H believed him. After that, Suspect Y deliberately stayed in a separate room, but he chose the room directly across from Suspect H's room. That way, he could monitor Suspect H at any time. When Suspect Y discovered that Suspect H had gone to get a haircut and was planning to meet someone online, he realized something dangerous. Suspect H might be trying to start over. Or worse, he might expose their whereabouts. So Suspect Y decided to act. That night, he and Suspect H agreed that each of them would drink poison in their own rooms. But in reality, Suspect Y never drank it. He returned to his own room, lay on the bed, and pretended to be dead. At the same time, he kept watching Suspect H's movements. When Suspect H returned to the hotel, he was terrified. He walked to Suspect Y's door and knocked. He wanted to confirm whether Suspect Y had really taken the poison. But there was no response from inside the room. Suspect H believed that Suspect Y was already dead. Under overwhelming fear and despair, he went back to his own room and drank the poisoned peanut milk. Early the next morning, after Suspect Y confirmed that Suspect H was dead, he immediately checked out. The most chilling part of this case is not only the killer's brutality, it is the fact that one of them created trap after trap. He used a bloody handprint to mislead the police. He used a jacket with someone else's name to redirect the investigation. He used poison to stage a suicide. He even tried to use his accomplice's death as the final shield to escape justice. But in criminal investigation, the most important thing is often not ignoring the smallest abnormal detail. Why was a business card put back into a bag? Why did a name appear so conveniently inside a jacket? Why would a man knock on another room's door before his death? The truth is often hidden inside those small things. that simply do not feel right. At this point, the murder case involving the family of 5 at the shop was finally solved. And this case once again proved something. The perfect crime only exists in the killer's imagination. As long as traces are left at the scene, as long as behavior appears abnormal, and as long as one detail remains unexplained, the truth will not stay buried forever. Because evidence does not lie. Only people do.